Serious. What's something creepy that has happened to you that you still occasionally think about to this day? Part 1. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. When I was maybe 10, I was over at a friend's house hanging out. Her neighbor was out of town and my friend was feeding the cat while they were gone. So my friend and I went over to feed the cat. Immediately upon opening the door, we heard someone walking upstairs. They were loud, heavy, slow footsteps, like didn't even sound human. My friend and I just looked at each other and sprinted back to her house. The worst part was we told her mom and the mom didn't believe us and made us go back and finish feeding the cat alone. We were terrified but did it. When the neighbor came back, they found that their house had been broken into. ETA. Thank you for the awards. I've never gotten any before. As for my friend's mom's reaction, we were in upper-end suburbs in the early 2000s. At the time I think people thought these were incredibly safe with no crime. Not the magnets for robbery they often were. It also probably totally sounded like we thought it was a monster, ghost. At that age we didn't really understand what it was. But definitely in the future when my kids are scared, even if it's a monster, I will know better to listen to them. I took an Uber at around 11 p.m. to get to my house. Halfway through, he started taking random turns into smaller streets citing traffic. We weren't even moving towards my destination at this point. I politely asked him to follow the directions that Google was suggesting, to which he asked me to shut up. He then ended the trip in the Uber app, but wouldn't stop the car or drop me off. This happened in India where the police are next to useless. I had pepper spray with me, I'm a guy. My friends used to laugh about how I always carry that thing everywhere. I started spraying at his direction, he crashed the car. I ran out. Here's what I still think about. Uber takes away the SOS option after the driver ends the trip. I was at an internal work event, party at a fancy hotel in a different state. It was 80s themed. I started talking to some dude. I barely knew anyone there, so I was trying to network, and he tells me he doesn't work for my company. Okay, no worries, I make a joke about free food. He stares me straight in the eye and picks up one of my French fries off my plate, dips it in ketchup and eats it without saying a word. I kind of freaked out and dropped the food in the trash and just walked out of the room and decided not to think about it. A few minutes later, there he is, staring at me. I change rooms again. I'm short, so I hid behind people and pretended to talk to people I kind of recognized from my home office. He follows me. Every few minutes I see him. I finally got the courage to approach a woman I knew the name of from some meetings and seeing her around the office. When I asked if the party had any kind of security, she immediately asked if it was about the dude in the blue jacket and white hat. Apparently she'd noticed him staring at me creepily, so I didn't have to try and convince anyone. Security took him away and everyone moved on, but I was scared and paranoid for the rest of the business trip. I had a stalker in college. Had to move dorm rooms and building 4 times in the middle of the night. Friends would help me get to my dorm by pretending we were going to theirs and making sure no one was around when I'd go into mine. He found 2 of the dorms and left notes in my room. It's been over 11 years and I live in a completely different state, but every once in a while I get the feeling I'm being watched and panic. When I was about 13, myself and a friend were walking to a middle school dance. I lived right across the street from the school. From my house there was about a 50-meter sidewalk to it from the main road. Anyways, as we're standing at the traffic light, waiting for our turn, I noticed a man in a van and a person in another car yelling at each other. I'm 100% sure I saw the man in the van wave a gun at the person. So he pulls up to the light and is waiting. He calls to me and my friend, says he needs directions. Who TF asked 13-year-olds for directions? I pull my friend's arm and tell her we need to leave. We start walking back towards my house away from the guy and he got out. Left the van right there at the light. My friend and I take off, full tilt. Make it halfway down the path before ducking into some side bushes. We're sitting there with our hands pressed over our mouths while trying to be as still and small as possible. I'm trembling and can hear my heart pounding in my ear. The man stands at the end of the walkway staring down towards my house. Luckily there's quite a few houses along the block, so it would have been impossible to tell which one we ducked into. Clear as day, in his hand at his hip is a gun. He finally leaves and my friend and I run back to my house to call my mom and the cops. I refused to walk to school after that. Pretty sure I almost got kidnapped when I was a kid. I was 10 years old walking home from school and an elderly couple driving by stopped and asked me for directions. They were looking for the street I was walking towards, so I pointed them in that direction. Even though my directions were very clear, both were acting confused and asked if I can get in the car and guide them there and then they would drive me home. I told them it was fine, my house was right here. I lied. They were pressuring, guilting me a lot and being too nice about wanting to drive me home. It gave me a really weird feeling in my stomach. So I pretended to walk towards a house that wasn't mine and they drove off. When I was in middle school, my girlfriends and I rode the bus home most days. The bus driver was this older guy who was super nice and fun and would allow us to play whatever radio station we wanted, and he would drop us girls off at home last so we could dance around on the bus. I remember he would let us stand at the front of the bus while he drove and he would purposely swerve to make us fall on top of him. I remember thinking it was weird, but it wasn't until I got older that I realized how wrong that all was. I decided to Google his name, I'm now in my 30s, and found that he is a convicted sex offender and is currently incarcerated. Scary part is when I think back, he obviously knew where I lived, and I remember there were several times when he'd drive past my house on the days I wouldn't ride with him. Keep in mind driving past my house was out of the way of his normal route, so it was intentional. I used to spend a lot of time walking through the woods, fields by my mom's house, and noticed a path one day that I hadn't seen before. I was listening to music following down this path as the trees around became more dense. You could tell it wasn't often people walked down there anymore. I remember it being more of mud, gravel trail. At this point I was deep in the woods, hadn't seen another person for a long time and shaded by the leaves of the trees. I don't know what made me notice at first, but I think I smelt the smoke. I stopped on the path, and maybe 5 meters away to my left in the trees was a small fire that had obviously been stamped out in a hurry. Still burning embers and smoke, so it had been done only a few moments before. Cue me realizing there wasn't anyone around that I'd seen, and that whoever had stamped out the fire was hiding in the trees somewhere. I have never felt a gut feeling to run like I did in that moment, straight back the way I came and did not look behind me until I was back into the main woodland with people around. We'll never know if I was paranoid and it was nothing, or if I avoided something bad that day, haha. When I was 13 I was in a bookstore and a grown-ass man approached me in the manga section and started asking me about my love life, if I had a girlfriend, etc. I left and watched the escalator from outside to make sure I wasn't followed. Next thing I know he's standing next to me and asks me to help him move a couch into his van. I kindly say fuck no and he jogs across the street and out of sight. I go inside and tell an adult who responds, "Yeah, they've been getting complaints like that." When I was 10 years old I lived in the middle of rural Alabama. We had some odd neighbors. Being curious kids, my friend and I followed my neighbor and his son and daughter one day when they left their house and walked into the woods. I was very familiar with the area because it was back when kids could roam free until the streetlights came on. Anyway, we trailed them for about 2 miles, through the woods, across an old cemetery, and down a railroad. They stopped at a clearing beside the tracks and my friend and I hid opposite of them and watched. They started digging and kept pulling up bones and putting them in a bucket. We got scared and bolted. I immediately told my parents but they didn't believe me. I'm 32 and remember that day clearly. When I was around 11 I was at softball practice and for whatever reason the practice ended early so I had to wait at the park for my grandpa to come and pick me up. I ended up having to wait alone for about 30 minutes because I didn't have a cell phone to call and tell my grandpa that practice ended early. I remember sitting on the swings when an adult man, in his 30s or 40s, came and sat down next to me. He asked if he knew me and I said no and he told me that I must just have one of those pretty faces that feel recognizable to anybody. I remember feeling happy about the compliment and I kept talking to him. Eventually, he told me that he had his car with him and that he could drive me home to my grandparents' house so that they didn't have to worry about picking me up and I wouldn't have to wait any longer. Being 11, I didn't think anything of this and proceeded to get into this stranger's car. Luckily, my grandpa showed up just in time and I remember seeing his car and jumping out to meet him. The stranger sped off without talking to my grandpa and that was the last I ever heard about it. This is such a vivid memory for me and I often find myself thinking about what would have happened to me and what a different person I would be today if my grandpa hadn't shown up when he did. Someone broke into my house while I was home alone when I was 19. I found them hiding behind this 7-foot-tall toolbox my dad had in the basement. I was about 5 feet away and saw their hands. I told them I was going to let them leave out the back door but I was calling the cops. I locked the basement door and ran upstairs, watched them run down the street with their shirt pulled up over their head. About a month later we got back from a trip out of town and we had been robbed. I can't imagine it wasn't the same person. When I was in 3rd grade, I was home alone with my quadriplegic grandma from after school until my mom came home. One day the phone rings, and I answer it and an unfamiliar man's voice says, "Hey, just one more bite. Did you just get home from school?" I say, "Yeah, who is this?" Instead of answering me, he started asking things like, "Do you ever touch yourself? Do you like to look at girls?" Being in 3rd grade, of course I was like, "Nope," and hung up pretty quick. I told my parents, but nothing ever came of it. I still wonder to this day who it was, how they knew my name, and my whereabouts. This was back on a corded landline with no caller ID either. Suicide trigger warning. This happened when I was 7. I was walking downtown with my dad who was buying a CD. We used to go to the record store and he'd chat music with the workers and I'd play on the Sega Dreamcast. I remember there was a guy watching me play and it looked like he was crying. He was just kind of staring at me. But because I was 7 and had vidya, I didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes later there was a bunch of people gathering outside, so we went out to see what the commotion was about. The guy who was crying was now on top of the roof standing on the ledge. He screamed, "This is for you, Daniel, my name," and jumped. My dad put his entire body over mine to prevent me from seeing it, but the guy who jumped died. I thought about it every day for over 20 years. Skip ahead to about 5 years ago. I'm now at a Christmas staff party, drinking heavily with my team. A guy on said team and I have heart-to-hearts about our pasts, and he tells me that he is bisexual. However, he hasn't been with a man in 20 years. He used to date a man behind his girlfriend's back, who committed suicide when he wouldn't leave her. Coworker's name is Daniel. He was in the crowd with me. 2 strangers forever changed together, but 20 years in the past. This may not be creepy to some, but it haunted me for most of my life. I moved into a shared house and my housemate told me half the house had burned down and been rebuilt, and the ghost of the old man who died in the fire visited them. I never had any experience of the old man, but when half asleep I'd very clearly feel a cat or 2 jump onto my bed, settle down and purr. It happened often, it was quite chilled out and I didn't mind. I would hear the distinctive thump of a cat jumping off the bed from time to time, but there was never a physical cat there. Once in that house, but a different bedroom, I had a terrifying lucid dream in which a possum, cat-like hand, claw was coming up from inside of my bed, clawing my thigh. It hurt so much I thought I might be gouging myself in my sleep, but woke up unharmed. Months later I moved out and met the landlord, who lived a few doors down, to return keys etc. I said something like, "Must have been scary when the house burned down, killed the owner. Were they living here at the time?" He said, "Oh no, the owner was fine, he got out. But he had about a dozen cats and several of them died in the fire." I'm pretty sure I was sharing my bed with ghost cats. Not sure what the story was with the dream, but I've had a couple of lucid dreams in my time and they have always been incredibly scary. My dad never went on vacations with us, workaholic. So every year it was my mom, my 2 sisters and I. One year we rented a little cabin at Lake of the Ozarks. A storm rolled in one night and in the flashes of lightning you could just make out an old lady standing out in the storm watching our little cabin. My mom got more and more freaked out as time passed and the lady just stood there, hair blowing in the wind staring at us. Mom finally got the nerve to call out to her, "Go away. You don't belong here," but she wouldn't budge. Next morning, the sun comes up and she's still standing there. Only it turns out it's a mop draped over a clothesline. I was camping in the Simpson Desert on a multi-day trip. It was a very remote location. We hadn't planned on stopping at this point, but it was getting late and one of the trailers had blown a tire, so we decided to repair it and then call it a day. Being so remote, there aren't any signs for anything, but according to our map the land we were on was military, probably for training and stuff. We didn't think much of it at the time, but I dare say we shouldn't have been there. Anyways, it did add to the eerie, remote and desolate feeling in the area. I remember after dinner we were all stargazing. There were so many meteorites and satellites whizzing around, it was fantastic. I remember watching one satellite move, very slowly, much slower than the rest. Then I noticed another, not far from it, moving very slowly in the same direction. I pointed it out to the group and we were all watching these 2 slow satellites almost follow each other. Then the first one just made this hard right turn, and we were all like WTH. Then the one behind it did the same thing. And they continued to follow each other before both turning again. It really fucked with me, I couldn't explain it at the time. And it was so bizarre, I have no idea what it was. I'm not one to put much heat into conspiracies or aliens or the like, but it fucked with me for sure. The only logical conclusion I can come to, and it does help me sleep a little better at night, is that they were geostationary satellites changing altitudes, orbits? But I'm no space expert, that's the best I have come up with. I have no clue what I saw that night. One time there was this huge snowfall in my town, on Christmas Day, which is weird for us. Anyways, me and brother and sister's boyfriend and a couple others all went tobogganing on this hill at the ball fields. There were also some trees at the park which I climbed and then just let myself fall out of backwards and land in the snow below. Was a great day, had lots of fun. A while later I was walking near those trees and the snow had melted down to reveal they were surrounded by rebar stuck into the ground with tape around them to stop people going up to them, I guess. I must have fallen right in between the pieces of rebar. If I had been in just a bit different of a position, I'd have probably been impaled by rebar on Christmas Day. Still weird to think about. I commented this on a different AskReddit some time ago. I was probably 11 or 12. There was a telephone pole in our backyard that stood in the middle of our back fence. An electrician was working on it and needed access to our backyard for a couple days. One of the nights, my best friend was over for a sleepover, and we were in the fort we made in my room. I was facing toward her, away from my bedroom door, and she gets startled and lets put kind of a half-hearted scream, yelp. She said she thought for a split second she saw a mon's face peering between the sheets through the entrance to our fort. We both felt really creeped out the rest of the night but just fell asleep eventually. The next day or so my family realized that 2 of our motor scooters we kept in the back were missing, and sometime later my dad recognized the electrician on Sacramento's Top 10 Wanted. I'm pretty sure that night was the night he stole the scooters and he must have come inside the house through the back door and left or something when he realized we were awake. I can't really remember how old I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old. But I was walking to school and this older guy, mid-60s, was going the other direction. I remember thinking he looked weird, because it was early so the daylight was fairly dim but he wore sunglasses, it wasn't cold but he was wearing a black trench coat. I stepped off the sidewalk to go around him out of arm's distance because even my child brain registered that he wasn't someone I wanted to allow close to me. Turns out I was right. This wacko starts kicking leaves and throwing mulch at me from a nearby garden. I was too freaked out to register what he was shouting, but he was grunting out something. I sprinted for about 2 blocks before I got to crossing guard in front of my school. I thought about not telling someone, but it kept haunting me for the rest of the day until I finally told my parents. We filed a police report, but I have no idea what happened to him. I was about 12 years old and I was playing hide and seek. I was hiding behind a tree, but it was also next to a road. 2 guys pulled up in a car and asked if I wanted to see their dog. I said sure. Then they said it was in the back seat and I would have to go into the car to see it. At that point I was getting a bad feeling, so I said never mind. They insisted one more time for me to see it in the back seat and I said no. Sometimes I wonder where I would be now if I was stupid enough to do it and how terrifyingly easy it is to lure other kids into that situation. Okay, here's one. In the late 80s, Mom was in the market for a house and finally found one. She met the lady who owned it, signed a contract and all that, and a few days later the lady was brutally murdered, stabbed repeatedly in the house. I don't know what my mom was thinking, but she went through with the purchase, even though the murderer was still on the loose. My mom and dad had divorced, then my dad died, but for years she suspected he must have ordered a hit on her and they had killed the wrong person, because he was that type of abusive person who would. Anyway, the bloodstains never fully came off the carpet, and it was just a creepy reminder. The killer was never caught, so it was always kind of creepy living there. The neighbors talked and suspected the husband or some workers who had done some work in the house a few days earlier, since there was no sign of forced entry, but didn't convict anyone. One day, a little after my mom had moved into the house, a teenage boy knocked on the door. My mom asked who it was, and he said he was a neighbor and asked if he could borrow a cup of sugar. She didn't open the door, just said she didn't have any, and didn't think anything of it. Anyway, 23 years later, they had opened some cold cases and found the killer. It was that neighbor kid, 15 years old at the time, and he confessed he came into the house by asking the lady to borrow a cup of sugar. If my mom had opened the door, she would have probably been killed too. When I was in elementary school, my brother and friends would ride bikes around our apartment complex, and one time a guy in a station wagon drove up and tried to offer us Halloween candy he had left over. He was kind of weird and kept trying to get us to get closer to pick out what candy we wanted. We felt kind of weirded out by him, but thought it was just goofy, so we all jokingly ran away yelling, "Stranger danger," like we had seen in videos at school. A couple months later, the same guy pulled up to us asking for directions. We told him we barely know our way around because we are just kids, but he tried so hard to get us to come closer and point on the map where we were. We all did the same thing and ran away jokingly yelling for help. It wasn't until the third time he tried to lure us into his car months later, offering a ride home, that we got a little freaked out. He got out of the station wagon this time and said he wanted to put our bikes in his car. We all freaked out and started actually yelling in fear for help and sped towards my friend's door. His mom leaned out the kitchen window to see what happened, and the guy leapt back into his car and burned rubber. Now I'm thinking I need to look up missing children in my hometown during the 90s. When I was 16, I went to Tampa with a friend. We were staying in a shitty hotel with a pool. That evening we decided to go take a dip. Everything was fine, it was just us at the pool and a table of adults with a little boy. We were on the opposite side of the pool when the little boy ran over to us and started chatting. It was pretty evident that the kid was lonely and the adults weren't paying any attention to him. Now, this kid was young. Probably around 7 years old. I talked to him, cause he wanted to talk to me, and I didn't think anything of it. He asked us if we were going to the theme park there. We were, and asked how long we've been in town. Then out of nowhere he asks us if we like vodka. It kinda hit me as weird, cause I'm not sure I even knew what vodka was at age 7. I said no, we don't drink. He then told us that his parents let him have a few sips of their drinks and they would let us drink if we went back to their room. This is when I got really creeped out. Me and my friend got the hell out of there and ran back to our rooms. I'm not sure if the kid was just weird, but I kinda felt like the people at the table, kids' parents, were trying to lure us to their room using their child. Very scary. My brother and I went on a walk in our rural neighborhood when I was 12/13 and he was 10/11. We only just turned the corner on our street when a small car with 4 large men slowed down right beside us. When their car got a bit ahead of us, they sped down the road. It ended in a cul-de-sac, so there was nowhere to go, either on of the side streets that were dead ends or back to the main, back road. I got a bad feeling about it, so I dragged my brother home. He didn't fully understand what was going on and was mad, but my gut told me to run back home.